I think that it's time for us to have a conversation that I think many of us have avoided. But I think it's necessary for us to have a conversation about where we are and where we've been, but ultimately where we're going and what does it look like to get there. I think that until we sit down and have this conversation, I think that we're going to continue to fall into the cycle of revisiting this same space until whatever the cycle is pulled up by the root and it has been destroyed. And we move forward with healing. And that goes for a national, global scale, as well as your life as well as the individual things that you are dealing with, oppressed by, and consistently having to fight. Whether it's your health, your finances, your children, your relationships, I think that we have to have a very difficult conversation. And I want to use this allegory where there are parallels to what's happening globally as well as what's happening individually in your life. I want to use an allegory where there are parallels using the idea of King David. But I want to give us context of David in order to identify those parallels and how they play out and how the victory is won through strategic planning and thinking and acting. And sometimes the point of that strategic planning, it does not look as though you're planning. It looks as though you are actually being oppressed. But the development and the tools that have been grown inside of you or that grow or evolve inside of you during that season of oppression and that season of being tried and being marginalized or being fought against, that what develops inside of you during that time, it prepares you to conquer the giant so that you can indeed win and take the rightful place that God has had for you since the very beginning of time, since the foundations of the earth. Let's go back in this story and let's really make the connection of the parallels. We all know the story about David, and we know the story of him fighting Goliath and becoming the king because of that major feat. But let's go back just a little and just figure out how David got there. And I want you to connect the parallels as I'm beginning to tell the story. I might not identify them all the way through, but I want you to connect the parallels for your life and globally, you as a people. So we have David, right? We have him in the household of Jesse, his father, and he has these 7 brothers that are military trained. In the eyes of people, David's 7 brothers were the upper echelon. They were the ones that were poised correctly. They looked for what society would have said to be the ones who would have been the next in line. Saul was the king at this time, and he had done some things that were unright, unjust in the eyes of God, and so God had rejected him. God had rejected Saul, and so he sent Samuel in order to find another king to replace Saul. And so Samuel arrives to the house of Jesse, and as he arrives to the house of Jesse, we've got Jesse's is coming before Samuel, and Samuel says, "Hey, do you have any sons?" And so Jesse begins to line his sons up one by one. He presents his best. And one by one, Samuel says, "No, this isn't the one. No, this isn't the one. They look like it. They act like it. They are dressed like it. Their occupation would say that it is, but this isn't the one." And so he finally goes through all of his sons and he says, "Is there any more?" And Jesse says, "Yeah, there's one, but he's out in the sheep pasture tending to the sheep." Because in truth, David's brothers didn't really think too highly of him. They had oppressed him to the position of just being one that would care for the sheep. He wasn't out in the field and fighting in wars, or he wasn't out in the world fighting in the army and wasn't properly poised as the other ones had been. He was on the back burner. He had been pushed aside. And so when Jesse brings David from the field and he presents him before Samuel, Samuel identifies that this is the one. And it's amazing that God can put his hands on and has anointed a particular person or people. He could anoint them and yet they be in a position of being overlooked, marginalized, and pushed to the side. But yet and still, they were God's chosen. David was God's chosen. Now, I want you to notice what happens in this story, because Samuel goes and gets the oil and he pours the oil on David's head because he recognizes that he is the one. But then after that, David is sent right back into the field, right back into the place of oppression. And you would think to yourself that if you recognize that I am king, why aren't you putting me in the position of being king? If you recognize that I am great, why aren't you putting me in the position of being the great that I am, that God has called me to be? But what you have to realize is that many times other people cannot see it in you because your time has not come. That's number one. But number two, there are people that are just jealous of what you have because God has put his hands on you. There are people that are infuriated or that are angry because it wasn't them that was chosen. And so they will push you aside as though you don't even matter. There are whole sectors of people that are God's chosen people that have been dismissed and have been marginalized and pushed aside because of the fact that everyone else wants their chance. They want to look as though they are the ones. But it doesn't matter how they pretend. It doesn't matter how much they are trying to push other people aside. When God has his hand on you, there is nothing that anyone can do to prevent God from using you. And when we get to 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse number 7, there's a clear indication of this. It says, "For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart." There are so many people that would try to isolate you into a box of saying you don't look the part. You don't look like you could be this. You don't look like you could be the king. But it never is about the looks. It's about who God has anointed to be the next in line. And for some of you, you are the next in line. For some of us, we are the next in line, despite the fact of having to go back into the field for a little bit, despite the fact of having to be pushed aside a little bit. There is something in the being pushed aside that grows and develops our tools and our resources and whatever we need in order to actually arrive to the place that God is calling us to. Now, as customary, and Jesse goes and sends David on a journey, and he says, "I want you to take your brother some lunch." And he goes and he meets his brothers because he's still having to serve his brothers. He's still in the position of being a servant, even though he's been anointed as the king, even though God has chosen him. They still allowed him to be in the position of being a servant. So he's taking his lunch, and he does this, and he does it with, I'm going to say, a smile. He does it because he knows who he is, despite what's happening around him. He goes ahead humbly and he follows through because there is a time that is coming. And he has to be strategic until that time comes. Now, the next part of the story, he gets to the place where he realizes and recognizes that his brothers and all of the other people of the army officials are trying to conspire ways to destroy the enemy, which was Goliath. They were all sitting around racking their brains and fumbling, not able to actually accomplish the task because they were not anointed to accomplish it. So no matter how much they tried to pretend, no matter how much they tried to put on this falsified persona, they were not able to accomplish the task of destroying Goliath because they were not anointed to do so. David sees the opposition and he looks at Goliath and he says, "Certainly I can take him. I'm trained to do this. I can do this." And they all start laughing at him because they look at him and consider him to be the lesser than. They consider him to be not as strong, not as intelligent, not as beautiful, not as trained, not as competent. That's how they perceived him, as though he was one that was not hired for the position as others were hired for the position, that he didn't qualify. He just showed up this day. I know that you know that there are some parallels that are there. And so David says, "I can do it." So Saul looks at him knowing that he had already given him the oil to be the king. And Saul says, "Okay, you go ahead and do it. but I want you to put on my clothing. Now, this is the part where I want you to pay attention. He puts on Saul's garments and he tries to walk around in Saul's garments as he's preparing to go and slay Goliath. And he realizes when he puts Saul's garments on, it doesn't work. Because as long as you are operating under the auspices of someone else's thing, you will never do what you were called to do. As long as you are putting on their ideas, their concepts, their precepts, without reaching back into the lineage of who you were created to be, of how God has created you. And if I'm talking to you specifically, the things that God has called you for, the instances that you have lived through, the life that you have been prepared to, your authentic self. If I'm talking about a group of people, I'm talking about what your ancestors did, what your forefathers did. That as long as you are operating under a fake auspice or under something that has been given to you, you will never accomplish the task of destroying the enemy. It is not until David said, I can't go in these things. Just give me my sling. Just give me the little unorthodox thing that you think is ghetto, that you think is witchcraft, that you think is craziness, that you think is some historic old type of practice, or that you think is some old prayer or this old fasting or this old shouting or speaking in tongues or this old warfare. There must be strategy when you're going to accomplish defeating the enemy. And this season, what God is calling us for is for us to be strategic, that we can no longer play games as normal, that we can no longer do it loudly and boldly, that we have to conspire to be decisive, that we must conspire to be almost to plan with so much great precision that it cannot be thrown off by the enemy. That we got to start to tap into our tools and our resources, and we've got to strategize together of ways to actually accomplish the task. Because sometimes the accomplishing the task is not always fighting head on. Sometimes accomplishing the task is being strategic with our silence. Sometimes accomplishing the task is being strategic with what you do with your money, where you spend your money, where you show up, and where you refuse to spend your money. That sometimes is the strategy to be wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove. So David goes and he puts on his own garments. And we know the story. He defeated Goliath, and that set him up to be king. It was strategy. It was returning to who he was created to be. It was operating in his truth, despite the oppression. It was leaning on what he had learned while he was in the sheep pasture. There are groups of people, and if you look at yourself right now, you have made it through everything that was thrown at you. And what and how you made it through, the lessons you learned were necessary for where God is taking you next. If I was to use a message or a subject for you to lean upon as you go through this week and as you go through this month and as you go through the remainder of this year, as you are preparing to slay the giant and to win on every single force, every single place, every single area in your life, as we prepare to win, there is the path that they did not expect. There was the path that they did not expect because they thought that oppressing you would destroy you. What they did not realize was that during the oppression of you, during the rejection of you, you develop skills that were only taught by way of the pressure that came at you, that's going to set you up for success, to actually be everything God has called you to be. I want to thank you guys so much for watching. That's all I'm giving you now. I want you to come back next week. We're going to talk just a little bit deeper. But thank you for spending time with me today. I appreciate you. I love you. And This is the path they did not expect. Watch what God does next. I love you. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for every one of you that send messages to me weekly. Thank you for every person that gives to me, that sows into this ministry that I give unto you. Thank you so much for your prayers. If you want to consider how you can, there is a link right down in the bottom. You can click on that. Thank you so much. Have an amazing, amazing week. God bless you today.